You have been told that your sensitivity is a weakness and your isolation is a defect. Since childhood, you have been conditioned to believe that your worth depends on how available you are to others. Yet beneath the surface, there is often a quiet exhaustion, an endless fatigue that comes from performing a role that was never truly yours. Carl Jung, one of history's most profound explorers of the human mind, saw something very different. He identified a rare type of person who walks alone, not because they are broken, but because they are fundamentally different. Jung did not see these individuals as outcasts. He saw them as psychologically formidable. But he also left a warning. According to Jung, there exists a particular personality type whose greatest gift can easily become its greatest danger. He called attention to those who live by intuition, people who sense what others cannot yet see. And if that describes you, then what comes next may explain your entire life.
Jung believed some people are deeply connected to a symbolic current flowing directly from the unconscious mind. They do not navigate life through logic alone. Their compass points inward. These are the individuals who sense outcomes before evidence appears. They detect shifts in people, situations, and environments long before anyone else notices them. They often understand what is emerging before it is fully formed. The problem is that society rewards proof. It rewards statistics, certainty, and visible results. Intuition offers none of those things. It whispers rather than shouts. It provides feelings before facts. As a result, intuitive people often spend years doubting themselves. They learn to suppress insights that later prove accurate. They become reluctant to speak because they cannot explain how they know what they know. What begins as a gift slowly becomes a burden. And according to Jung, that burden can become dangerous if left unchecked.
Jung warned that intuition must be expressed. When inner visions remain trapped inside the mind, they begin to take on a life of their own. The unconscious is meant to communicate with consciousness, not replace it. Yet many intuitive people grow up feeling misunderstood. Their perceptions are dismissed. Their insights are ridiculed. Eventually, they stop sharing altogether. The inner world becomes private territory. At first, this seems like protection, but over time, isolation from expression creates a different problem. The mind becomes crowded with ideas, symbols, possibilities, and imagined futures that never reach reality. Jung believed that under these conditions, a person stops observing their visions and begins living inside them. The gift of intuition becomes dissociation. The source of wisdom becomes a prison. And to understand why this happens, we need to look at the social world most people live in every day.
Most human beings are heavily influenced by the groups around them. People often believe they are making independent decisions when, in reality, they are repeating patterns they absorbed unconsciously. They adopt beliefs, values, preferences, and behaviors because everyone around them does the same. Jung understood this collective influence well. But the intuitive loner often exists outside of it. Not because they are rebellious, not because they are antisocial, but because they never fully plugged into the system in the first place. While others regulate themselves through approval, the loner learns to regulate themselves through solitude. Their identity is less dependent on applause, acceptance, or belonging. And that creates something many systems fear: a person who cannot be controlled through the threat of exclusion. Because exclusion only works when belonging is your greatest need.
The intuitive loner occupies a unique position. While others are busy performing social roles, maintaining identities, protecting identities, the loner often sits outside the performance itself. They see patterns. They notice contradictions. They observe the gap between what people say and what people actually do. Once you recognize these patterns, it becomes difficult to unsee them. You start noticing the invisible rules that govern groups. You recognize the topics that cannot be discussed. You become aware of collective agreements that everyone silently protects. And that awareness can make others uncomfortable, because every social system depends on certain illusions remaining intact. The person who points to those illusions often becomes the problem, not because they are wrong, but because they reveal what others would rather ignore. This is why insight frequently attracts resistance. Truth is not always welcomed, especially when it threatens comfort. Society often treats solitude and loneliness as if they are the same thing. Jung insisted they are completely different. Loneliness is painful because it involves a desired connection that cannot be achieved. Solitude, however, is chosen. It is a state where your own consciousness becomes accessible without constant interference from external expectations. In solitude, something remarkable happens. You begin hearing your own thoughts. You discover what you genuinely enjoy rather than what you've been taught to enjoy. You uncover values that belong to you rather than values inherited from your environment. The noise begins to fade, and in that silence, clarity emerges. The solitary individual becomes stronger because they can finally examine reality without needing it to be socially approved. But solitude also introduces a challenge that few people are prepared for. Sooner or later, you meet your shadow. Perhaps Jung's most important discovery was the concept of the shadow. The shadow contains everything about ourselves that we reject, suppress, or deny. These qualities do not disappear. They simply move into the unconscious. Often, the traits we judge most harshly in others are clues pointing toward our own unacknowledged shadow. Manipulation, aggression, selfishness, control, fear. When you spend enough time alone, you eventually encounter these hidden aspects within yourself. It is uncomfortable, sometimes even frightening. But Jung believed this confrontation is necessary, because until you acknowledge your darkness, it controls you from behind the scenes. The goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness. And awareness changes everything. Once you face your shadow and survive the encounter, something profound begins to happen. You stop fearing yourself. And when you stop fearing yourself, other people lose many of the tools they once used to control you. Shame becomes less effective. Judgment loses its sting. The threat of exposure loses its power. Jung described this state as psychological sovereignty. The sovereign individual accepts both light and darkness as part of their humanity. They no longer need to pretend to be flawless because they understand who they truly are. This creates a kind of inner freedom. You stop making decisions based solely on approval. You stop asking permission to become yourself. And eventually, there comes a moment of absolute clarity. A moment when integrity becomes more important than belonging. That is when genuine power emerges. In today's world, psychological sovereignty is becoming increasingly rare. Modern systems compete for your attention every second of the day. Algorithms study your behavior, platforms reward conformity, endless streams of information shape what you think, what you value, and even what you desire. Control no longer arrives through force. It arrives through convenience, through tiny agreements, through subtle nudges, through constant distraction. The intuitive loner possesses a unique defense against this. They see the script. They notice the invisible incentives shaping behavior. And once a hidden influence becomes visible, it loses much of its power. Awareness breaks the spell. But awareness alone is not enough. It must be paired with strategy.
One of the most effective strategies Jung's ideas suggest is something we might call calculated opacity. Not secrecy, not deception, selectivity. The need to explain yourself constantly is often a hidden form of insecurity. Powerful people understand that not every thought requires disclosure. Not every plan requires announcement. Not every intention requires justification. When others know only part of the story, their minds naturally fill in the blanks. Silence becomes influence. Mystery creates curiosity. And curiosity often generates respect. The strongest person in the room is rarely the loudest. It is usually the person who is comfortable, sitting in silence, speaking only when their words genuinely matter. And that restraint gives their words weight.
There is one final danger for the intuitive loner: the tendency to drift too far into abstraction. Intuition points toward possibilities, but life must still be lived in reality. Jung understood that the psyche requires balance. Without grounding, insight becomes fantasy. Without action, vision becomes escape. This is why routines matter. Physical movement matters. Daily rituals matter. Connection to the body matters. These simple practices act as anchors. They remind the unconscious that there is structure, order, and reality beneath the flood of imagination. The goal is not to abandon intuition. The goal is to bring intuition down to earth, to transform vision into action, to turn possibility into something real.
The final revelation is this: your isolation is not necessarily a malfunction. It may be part of your development. You were never meant to spend your life chasing acceptance from people who cannot see what you see. You were meant to become a bridge between what exists today and what is still emerging tomorrow. Like Jung's wounded healer, you descend into darkness not to remain there, but to return carrying wisdom. Stop seeking yourself in a world that demands masks. Stop forcing your soul into systems that were never designed for it. When you know who you are, including your strengths, your flaws, your shadow, and your truth, you become immune to the projections of others. You stop surviving the game. You start writing your own rules. Embrace your solitude.